Saturday morning, no alarm, coffee made at your own pace, the window open just enough to hear the birds, and nobody asking you what you want for breakfast. For a lot of men my age, that description sounds like a dream. For some of us, it's Tuesday. There's a version of this story that society has already written for us. Older man living alone must be sad, must be lonely, must have failed at something somewhere along the way. I've heard that story, and I want to talk about a different one. Not because loneliness isn't real, it absolutely is, and we'll get to that honestly, but because the assumption that a man living alone after 60 is somehow broken or waiting to be rescued, that assumption does a lot of damage to the man living it and to the families trying to understand it. So let's talk about what's actually going on. The first thing worth understanding, and this one takes a minute to really land, is that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, not even close. Loneliness is the ache of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is the choice, or the peace, of being with yourself and finding that enough. One is a wound, the other can be a kind of arrival. Psychology research has looked at this distinction carefully. Older adults who choose solitude, who move toward it rather than fall into it, tend to show greater emotional stability, lower anxiety, and clearer thinking than people who assume they should always be surrounded by others. Not because isolation is healthy, but because knowing what you need and being honest about it is. Most of us spent decades doing the opposite, filling every quiet moment, keeping the television on, staying busy so we didn't have to sit with ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that. But some men, by the time they reach their 60s or 70s, have finally figured out that the quiet isn't something to escape. It's something they've earned. Here's something men don't talk about much: the pressure. Not just the work pressure or the financial pressure, though those are real enough. I mean the constant social pressure of being a man at a certain age. Provide more. Be stronger. Don't show too much emotion, but don't be cold either. Be dependable. Be available. Be everything to everyone without ever asking for much back. For a lot of men, that pressure runs for 30, 40 years without stopping. And then, somewhere in their 60s, something shifts. The kids are grown. The career is winding down. And for the first time in a long time, there's space to ask a question that got buried somewhere along the way. What do I actually want? Some men find that answer inside a relationship. Some find it in a community. And some, more than people expect, find that what they want is quiet, a smaller life. A life shaped entirely around what gives them energy, rather than what drains it. Research on stress and aging supports something that feels obvious once you hear it. When chronic social stress decreases in later life, the physical benefits follow. Improved sleep, lower blood pressure, better heart health. The body, it turns out, keeps score of all those years of pressure. And when the pressure lifts, it notices. I'm not saying living alone is the path to good health. I'm saying that for some men, the peace that comes with it is doing real work. Work that shows up in their blood work, their sleep, their mornings. This is the part I want families to hear because it comes from a good place and still causes real harm. When a man in his late 60s or 70s is living alone, the people who love him often go into a kind of quiet panic. They call more than usual. They drop by unannounced. They ask the same questions in different ways. Are you eating? Are you getting out? Are you okay? And what they're really asking is, are you lonely? Are you falling apart without us? And here's the thing. That concern is love. It's real, and it matters. But the assumption underneath it, that a man living alone must be struggling, can feel like an accusation, like his choice or his situation is a problem to be solved, rather than a life to be respected. What families often don't see is what happens after they leave. The man who seemed quiet during dinner is up early the next morning, making coffee exactly the way he likes it, puttering in the garden, reading, calling a friend he's known for 40 years. He's not lonely. He's living. The question worth asking isn't, is he lonely? It's, is he connected? And connection doesn't require living with someone. It doesn't require daily contact. It requires depth. A few relationships where he can be honest, where he matters, where he's seen for who he actually is. Knowing the difference matters, and the only way to know it is to ask differently. Not, "Are you okay?" which gets a reflexive "fine" every time, but something more specific. What's been good lately? What are you looking forward to? What do I miss? I said we'd get to this honestly, so here it is. Not every man living alone has found his footing. Some are in genuine pain. And the danger with older men specifically is that the same stoicism that helped them survive decades of pressure now works against them. They don't ask for help. They don't name what they're feeling. They say, "Fine," because that's what you're supposed to say. The warning signs of harmful isolation are different from ordinary solitude, and worth knowing. A loss of interest in things that used to matter. Skipping meals not because you're not hungry, but because it doesn't seem worth it. Letting days pass without any real contact, not by choice, but by drift. A flatness that isn't peace. It's more like fog. If any of that sounds familiar, whether you're living it or you're watching someone you love live it, it's worth taking seriously. Not with alarm and not with assumptions, but with a real conversation. And if that conversation needs to happen with a doctor or a counselor, that's not weakness. That's the same practical thinking that gets a man to fix the roof before it leaks through the ceiling. The distinction between chosen solitude and harmful loneliness is real, and both deserve to be taken seriously, one respected, the other addressed. Here's what doesn't get said in the worried conversations around the dinner table. A lot of men living alone are doing something unexpected. They're taking better care of themselves, not because they're trying to prove something, but because when you remove the noise of other people's needs, you start to hear your own. You eat when you're hungry. You sleep when you're tired. You walk in the morning because you actually want to, not because you scheduled it. Routines become more personal, more consistent. There's nobody rushing you through breakfast, nobody changing the schedule, nobody's priorities quietly overriding yours. For men who spent decades running on other people's clocks, that kind of self-pacing can feel almost radical at first. And then, it just feels like health. Connection also doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Some men become closer to their children once the daily friction of shared space is gone. Some build friendships that go deeper than anything they had in their busier years. Some find purpose in mentoring, volunteering, or being the steady presence in a grandchild's life that they were too busy to be for their own kids. Love doesn't require a shared address. It requires showing up. And a lot of men living alone are showing up, just quietly, in ways that don't make it into the worried family conversations. There's a phrase I've heard from more than a few men in this season of life. They call it living at their own pace. And when they say it, there's something in their voice, not resignation, not sadness, more like relief, like a weight they'd been carrying so long they forgot it was there, finally set down. Aging does something to priorities. The things that used to feel urgent, status, comparison, the opinions of people who barely knew you, they lose their grip. What's left tends to be simpler, real friendships, meaningful mornings, work that matters even if it's small. The freedom to be yourself without performing a version of yourself for anyone else. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. For men who are living this chapter well, the message I'd offer is simple. The life you've built inside the quiet is worth trusting. You don't owe anyone an explanation for it. And you don't have to defend peace just because other people are uncomfortable with it. For the families watching someone they love live this way, the invitation is to look more carefully before you worry. Ask better questions. Trust that the man you raised or grew up with or spent decades alongside knows something about what he needs. And if you're genuinely concerned, say so directly. Not with pity, with love. And for the men somewhere in between, not quite at peace, not quite asking for help, I'd say this. The fog isn't permanent, and reaching out isn't starting over. It's just the next practical step, same as any other problem worth solving. Solitude and loneliness are different things, and treating them the same does real damage. The pressure that lifted when some men began living alone isn't something to mourn. It's something their bodies and minds have been waiting for. Families worry from love, but worry shaped by assumptions can feel like judgment. And the men living this chapter well aren't waiting to be rescued. They're just living, quietly, deliberately, at their own pace. That said, harmful isolation is real, and the difference between that and chosen solitude is worth knowing and worth asking about, honestly. I'd genuinely like to hear from you on this one. Whether you're living this chapter yourself or you're a family member trying to understand someone you love, what has this looked like for you? What did you get wrong at first? What shifted? Leave a comment below. These conversations go places that the videos alone can't reach. And if this landed for you, share it with a brother, a father, a friend, someone who might need to hear that what he's living isn't a problem to be fixed. We're here every week for the conversations that matter after 60. Take good care of yourselves.